As we reflect on these different children's stories this morning, we're looking at this last one, Elephant and Piggy, and what is up with Elephant? As I look at this story, he's indecisive, which ultimately makes him wasteful. Not only is he indecisive, but he's selfish, because ultimately it's all about him and him getting his ice cream. And he has a conscience because you see this struggle, but his conscience ultimately, he doesn't have the virtue to follow through on what he knows would be right until it's too late. He's lucky all it cost him was his ice cream. Anyway, I thought that was funny. Why would we think so hard about the elephant, right? This is an interesting story, right? There's a couple different ways I suppose we could look at elephant. I think you're not supposed to read it that way. I think you're supposed to read it as relatable, right? Relatable to you, seeing the struggle that he has between really wanting the ice cream but also really wanting to share. And I think viewing it this other way would be a little bit over the top and like you're missing the point of the story, man. There are two ways we could look at it, though. We could look at it that other way. We could be ungracious, unrelating to the character, and just dial it down to, look at this elephant's got problems. What's been interesting about the different children's stories, we're doing this series, we're doing 4 of them. This was the 3rd one. We also did Where the Wild Things Are, The Sneetches, and now this one. In each of them, the conflict is in the character's own heart. So if we go back to Where the Wild Things Are, Max, the little boy, his conflict is his own emotions and his ability to control his emotions, and the entire conflict rests within him, right? His mom loves him the whole time. His conflict is in his own heart. When we go to the Sneetches, in that story from Dr. Seuss, it's the same thing. The conflict is more how they're seeing themselves, and what they come to conclude by the end is they're seeing themselves, understanding themselves wrong. The conflict is within. And even here in this story with Piggy and Elephant, ultimately the conflict, if you will, is in Elephant's own heart. It's not out there. It's so easy to think the other way. We can look at a story like this, and it would be silly to sit here and rip Elephant, but we could do it. In the same vein, that's always true with everybody that we encounter. And I want to put up, is anybody familiar with Screwtape Letters? The Screwtape Letters is a book by C.S. Lewis. It's half a century old now, at least. But he wrote this book, and the book is Uncle Screwtape writing to his nephew Wormwood, and they're both underservants of Satan, right, or the devil, the powers of darkness. The idea is that Satan isn't everywhere. He's not God, but he's got all these minions that do work for him. So the Screwtape Letters are 2 minions communicating, and basically Uncle Screwtape writing to his nephew on how to be a better demon for people. And they often refer to the subject that they're trying to tempt in the story as the patient. So I want to read you this one. My dear Wormwood, be sure that the patient remains completely fixated on politics, arguments, political gossip, and obsessing on the faults of people they have never met serves as an excellent distraction from advancing in personal virtue, character, and the things the patient can control. Make sure to keep the patient in a constant state of angst, frustration, and general disdain towards the rest of the human race in order to avoid any kind of charity or inner peace from further developing. Ensure the patient continues to believe that the problem is out there in the broken system rather than recognizing there is a problem with himself. Keep up the good work, Uncle Screwtape. Interestingly, if you've ever read the Screwtape Letters, you won't find this in there. So somebody wrote this in the spirit of the Screwtape Letters, but these are not C.S. Lewis's words. But do they not ring a little bit true in imagining that the problem is out there and that there's not a problem in here? As we get into our text this morning from Luke chapter 7, this is a wonderful story that we hear, and there's so much to it. There's the actual people in the story, there's the parable Jesus tells, and there's some understanding that is coming upon the people who experience this encounter. But let's go back to the text, to Luke chapter 7, and set this up a little bit. So one of the Pharisees asked him, Jesus, to eat with him. And the Pharisee, who we're going to learn, is named Simon. And this would have been not abnormal for one wise person of status, in this case a Pharisee, to ask another wise person, in this case Jesus, who's on the rise, right? He's becoming more prominent with great teaching and with such a way of carrying himself, miracles, all of the things that Jesus is doing. He's rising in status and prominence. And so Simon here is doing something not uncommon, but something that's probably going to benefit him a little bit, because he's bringing, the latest and greatest thing that people are talking about, Jesus, in to visit with him, another wise guy, and they're going to talk about life and and what's important. And so they're reclining at the table and they're talking. And as they're talking, a woman of the city who was a sinner, and this is a code word of sorts, at least as we would understand it. When you get that label in the time of the New Testament, and it's recorded in that way, we can probably safely assume, well, hey, all people are sinners. What they mean by sinner is that this is a woman who has some sort of sexual sin attached to her, whether that's prostitution, whether that's adultery, whatever it is. If you see the phrase a sinful woman, it's most likely that's what's meant by it. And so there's a community awareness of who this woman is and how sinful she is. But the woman comes to the Pharisee's house, brings a flask of ointment, right? Pours it over Jesus' feet, wipes his feet with her hair, with the ointment, with her own tears even. She comes vulnerable. She puts herself at the feet of Jesus, completely humble, not even saying a word. She knows who she is, regardless of how she's been labeled. She knows who she is, and she knows specifically who she is before Jesus, a holy man for sure. Well, contrast that with the Pharisee. From the beginning, there's something in this for Simon. There's an opportunity for him to improve his own status. There's a possibility of him perhaps getting in with Jesus and wherever that's going to end up leading. But he does not see himself as one who needs to humble himself before Jesus. So consider the posture of the two characters. The sinful woman, completely vulnerable and just putting herself before Jesus and saying, I'm not worthy. And Simon saying, well, let's see what you have to offer me and what I could offer you. And the posture's different, for sure, to the point where Simon criticizes Jesus. If you knew what you were doing, if you were really a man of God, how would you let a woman like this even touch you? And Jesus does what Jesus often does, and he does this, I think, because he loves Simon. How well do any of us respond to directly being told that we're wrong? He tells a story. He tells a story hoping that perhaps Simon can draw his own conclusion, and it can be his idea that maybe he has the wrong attitude. So Jesus tells this story, this parable. It's simple. There's a guy who's lending money. He lends it to two people. To one, he lends a lot. To another, he lends a little. And then when they cannot pay, he forgives both their debts. Which one is more grateful? Which one loves him for the forgiveness of the debt more? And Simon answers honestly and correctly how you'd have to answer Jesus' question when he says, well, the one who had the larger debt. They're going to be more thankful, more grateful. And then Jesus gives us this truth. If you've been forgiven a lot, you love a lot. if you've been forgiven a little, you love little. Well, hold on. What does it mean to be forgiven much, forgiven a little? Doesn't Jesus forgive all of us for everything? Well, sure. Absolutely. In Jesus' death on the cross, he takes the weight of the sins of the whole world for all time on his shoulders. But do you understand that? And do you understand what that means for you? How much Jesus has forgiven you. See, if your posture towards God, this is ultimately what this parable, if we want to bring it home for ourselves, what's our posture towards God? Or maybe we can even start somewhere else. What's our posture toward life? What's our attitude toward life? How do we approach it? Are we owed something? Do we deserve something? How do you understand yourself? Good person? Can be good. How do you understand yourself? Not worthy? I suppose to some extent it depends on how often you look in your own heart, which kind of leads us back to that, not a real quote, but the Screwtape mock letter. Do we look in our own hearts to see what's wrong? And I think if we do, we will find that God is quite gracious to us. We can go really deep. We could stay surface level. It's not hard. Sometimes other people are better at this than we are ourselves, at pointing out what's wrong with us or that there is something wrong with us. Deeply rooted in our hearts. The way the Scripture talks about it is that no one is good, not even one person. That all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All we like sheep have gone astray, each to his own way. There's so many ways the Scriptures paint a picture of the brokenness of the human heart that's in each one of us. How often do we overreact to things that are not that big of a deal? How much damage do we do just in those reactions? I think about this with kids even. Sometimes it's the smallest thing, and because you're stressed in a bunch of other ways, you react way over what you should react. And that inflicts its own baggage. How often do we look at an opportunity? I know I'm guilty of this all the time. I see opportunities. God has gifted me with so many different opportunities. People who you can impact, people who you can bless, to have a disposition of generosity and graciousness toward, and you end up thinking of the opportunity that God has given as a burden, as something you have to do. What kind of person looks at it that way? Someone who needs work inside. Again, we could go real deep, we could go real shallow, but it's not hard to find what's wrong with us. In fact, if we're honest and really take a look at who we are, we know that God needs to have a lot of grace for us. I know he has to have a lot of grace for me. The problem, as many problems as there are out there, it is an evil and corrupt world, more so than we could even ever imagine. The problem can't always be out there. In fact, Jesus' work starts in the hearts of his own people, in the hearts of believers. He wants to work in our hearts first. The problems out there, Jesus makes clear, will always be out there. But he can work in our hearts and transform us, make us salt and light for the world. So what our posture is as we go to the Lord, in fact, what he says, what Jesus says directly in this parable, he who is forgiven much loves much. He who's forgiven little loves little. If we understand who we are, if you understand who you are, and that the God of the universe joined you, gave his life for you, what God has done in Jesus Christ for his world, if you understand who you are and that he did that for you, well, it's transformative in the way that you look and approach him and life itself. It gives you a whole different perspective. And I bet it's a more gracious perspective, a more generous perspective. When we understand who we are and who God is for us, it makes us more gracious and more generous because look at what he's done for us. What is our posture? What is our approach to life? How do we think of ourselves? We need God's Spirit to work in our hearts, to convict us, to draw us back over and over again to our own need for God's love and God's mercy, so that we might have that same love and mercy for others. Amen. Please stand. Let's confess our faith in the words of the Apostles' Creed.